Hello and welcome to Our Stories and Ourselves, a podcast about how our minds make stories and stories make us. My name is Kirsty, and in this show I talk about the stories we tell ourselves about the world, the stories we tell ourselves about history, and about how the way we think shapes these stories and shapes us. Today I'm going to talk about Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, a book about the hero's journey, which he also called the monomyth. What it is, what some of the criticisms of it are, and what all of this tells us about stories and our world. To start off with, who was Joseph Campbell? Campbell was born in New York City in 1904. He studied literature at Columbia University and then travelled to universities in Paris and Berlin. While there, among other things, he encountered the works of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, who greatly influenced his later work. He then returned to the United States and took a role as literature professor at Sarah Lawrence College in 1934 and taught there until he retired in 1972. He published his first original work, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, in 1949, and it is this book that he is best known for. It's a book about comparative mythology, which suggests that all myths are essentially the same journey, the hero's journey. To quote Campbell, "A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man." End quote. In the book, Campbell says that all myths follow these steps. The hero receives a call to adventure. He refuses the call. They meet an inspiring mentor. They decide to cross the threshold and accept the call. He leaves his home, faces obstacles, enemies, and allies, fails to achieve his goal, tries again, succeeds. Finally, he comes home with a reward. Various articles break these down into more steps, but I think that's a good enough summary for the purposes of this episode. Now, this probably sounds familiar, and it should. Many stories, Star Wars, A New Hope specifically, The Matrix, The Hobbit, they all follow this pattern. The Hero with 1,000 Faces, the book, became well known after George Lucas said he'd written Star Wars based on that structure. However, this is where the criticism of Campbell begins. There are many stories that do follow this pattern, but there are also many that don't. Campbell's claim that there is one narrative pattern at the root of every story is, to be honest, just plain wrong. Now, to be fair to Campbell, while people often talk about the hero's journey as being the only story, he was talking specifically about myths. However, even then, he ignored many counterexamples. Spencer McDaniel, a great history blogger you should check out, wrote a great article on this very topic. She points out that the Iliad, possibly second only to the Odyssey as one of the most famous Greek texts of all time, doesn't really follow the hero's journey template. The Odyssey does, more or less, and is the one that Campbell uses as an example, but he barely mentions the Iliad. If you're even remotely familiar with the Iliad, you'll know it doesn't really have the one single hero. Not only that, but the closest thing the story does have to a hero spends a chunk of the story sitting in his tent, not fighting. The Iliad does hit some of the beats of the hero's journey, but definitely not all of them. I won't go into great detail, as I think Spencer McDaniel's blog does a great job of covering it. I've linked it on the show website, so do give it a read. But this is one example of the flaw right in the heart of the theory. And it doesn't end there. There are so many examples of myths that don't fit this pattern. In fact, folklorists have detailed and complex processes for classifying stories. They do acknowledge that there are patterns, motifs, and themes that crop up repeatedly. But they also make clear that there is more than one possible narrative. I didn't have time to go deeply into the folklorist work for this episode, and it's definitely one I'd like to come back to. But I did find it interesting that one of the systems, the ATU, lists hundreds of possible plots. Now, that classification system does focus more on the motifs of the story, such as a soldier makes a deal with the devil, rather than what the actions of those motifs are. This was criticized by Russian academic Vladimir Prop. He came up with an alternative scheme that identified 31 plots, primarily in Russian folktales, which includes things like donor tests the hero or a magical agent is directly transferred. And while some of these motifs and plots fit into the hero's journey, many don't. And the classification schemes make clear that there are multiple plots. Now, this is just scratching the surface, and I need to do a lot more work to fully understand these systems. But I do find it interesting that the early stages of this folklorist work was completed before Campbell wrote The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Prop's work wasn't translated into English until the 50s, but early versions of what would become the ATU system were published in the US in 1928. I don't know. Maybe Campbell thought that the system was too granular and ignored the similarities he saw. But I do find it interesting that he ignored work that didn't fit his ideas. In fact, sometimes he even distorted his versions of the stories to get them to fit. One of the other examples Campbell uses is of the initiation rite of the Arente in northern Australia. In Campbell's telling, the boy undergoing the initiation rite ventures out into the unknown, alone, undergoes trials and challenges, and returns changed, a man. However, as Glenda Hambley describes in an article for the Journal of Screenwriting, the actual cultural beliefs and ritual tell quite a different story. To start with, the Arente culture, as with many Australian Aboriginal groups, have a cyclical rather than linear foundation to most of their stories and to their perception of time. People are connected to the dreaming, which is in simple, possibly too simple terms, their creation time, and are connected to each other across generations. They consider everyone to be almost part of one organism. Campbell, however, makes a big and very Freudian deal of the circumcision rites. Given how much skepticism Freud is viewed with these days, this is another clue to me that his arguments are flawed. Campbell is also very focused on the relationship of stories and the monomyth to dreams and Freudian dream interpretation, which is mostly a load of guff. But back to the rite. Campbell ignores the parts of the rite where initiates are taught the creation stories of their people. The knowledge that the initiate gains as part of the rite is not through crossing the threshold and venturing into the unknown, but through being taught the law of his community and being brought into the adult role within it. Boys do not become men through a journey, but are shaped into men by and within their community. So, in a way, it's almost the exact opposite of the journey of the hero going out alone and returning to change his community. In other words, Campbell projected his own beliefs onto existing stories which could, or should be interpreted in different ways. Given how interested Campbell was in psychoanalysis, I actually find it amusing he did such wholesale projection. For anyone who doesn't know, in psychology, projection is a description for what happens when a person displaces their feelings onto someone or something else. In this case, I'm going slightly broader and using it to describe Campbell projecting his ideas onto another culture and story. In the psychoanalytical tradition, Carl Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz argued that projection can be used to protect someone against their fear of the unknown. They suggest people project archetypal ideas onto things they don't understand as a way to create a more predictable and clearly patterned world. In other words, under the psychoanalytical framework that he used in his book, Campbell feared and didn't understand the stories he encountered from other cultures. So he projected his own structure onto them, even though it doesn't actually fit. Something he maybe should have been alert to, given his familiarity with psychoanalysis, but, well, obviously not. To bring it back to Campbell's book, he has received some praise for being more inclusive than other academics in the field, and considering a wider range of stories from different cultures. It was 1949, after all. However, at the same time, he squashed a lot of the complexity out of these stories and cultures. He cherry-picked the stories that fit his narrative and ignored or distorted those which didn't. In fact, even in the introduction to his book, he rather defensively mentions that not all stories fit neatly into the pattern he described. However, in his words, this is a book about the similarities. And that's all very well, but it seems to me a bit of a stretch to conclaim that there is one singular myth when you have to mention the differences in your introduction. In a way, the monomyth is a story Joseph Campbell told himself and managed to convince himself of, despite it only having a nodding acquaintance with the truth. It's a textbook case of confirmation bias. He started with a hypothesis and ignored or distorted anything which didn't fit. It's easy to see patterns everywhere if you look hard enough, and even easier if you're selective about what you look at. Another problem with the idea of the hero's journey is that it ignores the detail, the context, or the our stories and ourselves favourite word, nuance, of the myths. The Arente initiation is a good example of this. You have to know about the culture in which it takes place to fully understand it. Spencer McDaniel also covers this in her blog post. The Death Star, a planet-destroying superweapon from Star Wars, can be better understood in the context of the Cold War and fear of nuclear conflict. She also points out that the different ways the Sand People are portrayed in the original film and the recent production of The Mandalorian can be understood in relationship to the changing attitudes to the struggles of Indigenous peoples against colonization. Similarly, understanding the realities of the world when Shakespeare was writing helps the reader to understand his plays, and so on. You can enjoy the stories and get a lot out of them without this, but it does help to give it a deeper richness when you have that context. On the other hand, there is, of course, the literary theory of the death of the author, and it is possible to read themes into works that the author never intended. The recent Our Fake History podcast episode on The Wizard of Oz is, in a weird way, a good example of this. The book has been interpreted as at least two almost opposite political allegories that it is highly likely the author, L. Frank Baum, never intended. I don't necessarily see a problem with that. People will always find their own meaning in texts, but also understanding things from the period when the story was written, like the prevalence of snake oil salesmen and other con artists and flim-flam men, does provide context to the wizard and the story of Oz. And I think it's only fair that if you're going to make sweeping claims about the similarities of myths across the world, you do need to understand their context. So, while the society a story is written in has an influence on the story, as I talked about in episode 5, stories can also influence society. I think the primacy of the hero's journey in so much of our popular media has had some unwelcome effects. Or maybe I shouldn't say effects, as I can't say the media is the cause. Maybe these stories are part of our culture and the media reflects that. But I think this idea has some unhealthy elements. The hero's journey gives primacy to the single, usually male hero, who pursues individualistic goals. While the hero in Campbell's structure does return to his community at the end, with a gift, it's rare that it's something the community actually asked for. I do wonder if this feeds the main character syndrome so many people seem to have. Lots of people act like whatever they are doing is the most important thing in the world. Others only exist to help them, the hero, or otherwise they are obstacles that must be overcome. There is no room in this narrative for people collaborating on a group goal, or for illness, or self-care, consideration for other people. An article in the LA Review of Books pointed out that when people dare to step away from heroic expectation, the reaction can be swift and harsh. The article gives the example of Simone Biles taking a break from gymnastics competition when she needed to, and being roundly criticised for not pushing through. I think it also feeds into a lot of societal narratives, like something coming out of some politicians in the US at the moment about the need for war fighters and paying less attention to things like logistics in their armed forces. Now, anyone with even a slight nodding acquaintanceship with military history will know that an army marches on its stomach. Unfortunately, running the baggage train is not seen as heroic. So this does show us that while the monomyth isn't actually universal, there are a lot of people who do buy into it. It's definitely a part of Western culture. However, I think that's different to it being inherent to the human psyche. I've written things without thinking about the structure, flying by the seat of my pants, or a pantser, as the writing phrase goes. And it turns out that the story has followed the hero's journey pretty closely, as a fluke. Does that mean it's part of my psyche I was born knowing? I doubt it. I think it's more likely the result of the amount of hero's journey style narratives I've consumed across my life. They are common after all. I'm not denying that. I also don't think that the structure needs to be inherent to humanity to come up in multiple places across the world. Things that work well will keep coming up. Convergent evolution happens again and again. Multiple cultures came up with agriculture. And the hero's journey does work as a story structure, so it makes sense it appears in different places. I think that part of why the hero's journey as a concept is still popular is, in part, because of what it can tell us about narrative. I remember learning as a child that all stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. I found this to be a singularly unhelpful piece of information. After all, so does a measuring tape. Even the 3-word version of the hero's journey, that it includes separation, initiation, and return, is more useful, as it at least suggests an option for what can happen at the beginning, middle, and end of a story. In other words, it can be a useful tool for writing structure. Of course, it's important to make sure you have the right tool. Depending on who you ask, there are 3, 7, 20, or even 36 basic plots. And they all have their different strengths. So if you're going to pick one for writing, it doesn't have to be the hero's journey. In fact, one article I read pointed out how the hero's journey can trap writers into a corner. By the end of the journey, the hero, if the structure is followed closely, is almost godlike in his power. This leaves little room for sequels unless it's planned as a multi-story arc from the beginning. I see where the author of this piece was coming from. When you have a single hero and they achieve their goals and come into their power, there's not much more room for further growth or new obstacles. Neo can stop bullets by the end of The Matrix. Maybe that's why the sequels fell a bit flat, at least for me. He didn't really have anywhere to go. I think this is also why I've rather gone off the latest Marvel movies, but that's for another day. Of course, more human characters can continue to grow and change over time, as we all do. And that can be a way to continue their story. But sometimes it has to be a very different story, and this takes it outside of the hero's journey. For example, the story of Aragorn ruling Gondor day to day would be a very different book and would only appeal to a small amount of Lord of the Rings audience. I also think it's maybe part of why the Star Wars prequels struggled. There are interesting stories to be told about trade wars and all sorts of things, but they're not Star Wars style stories. There are ways around this. For example, podcaster and author Joe Kasabian, who, if things go to plan, I'll soon be interviewing, has written several series where the characters grow over the course of several books. Spoiler alert, I guess. In his first fiction series, the main characters do a lot of growing over the first book, but the second throws them into a completely new scenario where they are forced to develop new skills and grow in different ways. In fact, the second book opens with one of the characters dealing with day-to-day bureaucracy, although of course it doesn't stay there. Story structures can be useful generalizations, but there's also a limit to how useful a generalization is. An outline doesn't make a good story. I've read, let's be honest, I've also written a few stories that follow recommended story structure and still suck. It takes much more than that, even when you're using it as a tool. One of the key elements of the hero's journey is the introduction of conflict, and if you're writing a story, eventually you do need some sort of conflict to keep it engaging. Well, I guess maybe unless you're writing Waiting for Godot, where the absence of the conflict is the point. Even then, a new character arrives to provide some interest partway through. However, so much of what makes a good story is what the conflict is, who the characters are that experience it, and how they react. A character could go through all of the steps of the hero's journey, but if they don't earn their victories, the story's probably going to fall flat. And there are countless different ways that they can do that. To quote Rachel Leifer, "To me, monomyth theories are like saying, all beverages are liquids occupying a container, as if that were enough to tell you the difference between a cosmopolitan and a mojito." End quote. I'd actually go further. That description doesn't contain nearly enough information. Someone taking it literally could end up drinking a tin of paint. I guess one outcome, even if an unplanned one, of the hero's journey theory is to get people talking. As always, when reaching these episodes, I read a lot of articles, some in academic journals, blogs, magazine articles. There are a lot of comments on many of these, and rather than the standard "don't read the comments" rubbish, a lot of them were thoughtful and engaged. I picked up a bunch of interesting ideas from them. One was from someone named Rich Ware on the article about how the hero's journey can back writers into a corner. They pointed out that there are several other frameworks for story outlines, specifically one by Orson Scott Card, the MICE or MICE quotient, which asks about the milieu or setting of the story, the idea, the character, and the event. I haven't come across it before, but I think it's great, as it's a useful way of thinking about a story and takes all the different elements of it into account. There was another comment on that blog that was less kind and was suggesting that all criticisms of the hero's journey are recent and capitalist and reject ancient knowledge. Completely disagree with that one. As I think I've already made pretty clear, humans have always told a range of stories. If anything, the trend towards the hero's journey in modern cinema is due to a narrow bias about what sells, rather than the opposite. However, there do seem to be a lot of people, in these comments at least, who are very tied to the idea of the hero's journey and will twist and reduce any story until it vaguely fits. I don't really know why. Surely it's okay that there is more than one story, and has always been more than one story. Humans are complex, varied beings, after all. And the hero's journey is a fun story. It's just not the story. If you shed it of its baggage, remove the expectation that all stories should fit it, then it can take its place as one of a range of common arcs that works. To get a bit meta about it, it's not the hero's journey itself that is the problem. It is Campbell's story about that story. It's the claim that the monomyth is the only story, the one narrative, intrinsic to humanity, and cannot be escaped. That's where the problem is. So I hope it's become clear through this episode that there is no one story, whether it's within a culture, as with Greek myths, or between cultures. There are similar beats to a lot of stories, but each one does it in its own way, in its own context. Stories can use some of the elements of the hero's journey, or invert them, or even wait for Godot and make the story about there not being a journey. As the saying goes, life would be very boring if we were all the same, and I think that can also be said for stories. There's some value in the concept of the hero's journey as one of a range of narrative structures, but the concept of the monomyth needs to go. I decided to bring the closing quote that I usually put right at the end of an episode forward today, as I think it's a good way to describe my thoughts on there being one unifying theory of story. It's Terry Pratchett again, this time from Sorcery. To quote, "The astrophilosophers of Kroll once succeeded in proving conclusively that all places are one place, and that the distance between them is an illusion. And this news was an embarrassment to all thinking philosophers, because it did not explain, among other things, signposts. After years of wrangling, the whole thing was then turned over to Lin Tin Weedle, arguably the disc's greatest philosopher, who, after some thought, proclaimed that, although it was indeed true that all places were one place, that place was very large." End quote. So that's where I'll wrap up today. Thank you for listening. As always, my sources are on my website, ourstoriesandourselves.com. If you have thoughts, drop me an email at ourstoriesandourselves@gmail.com or on Blue Sky at ourstories.bluesky.social. I've also set up a Patreon. There's no bonus content yet other than some exclusive cat pictures, but I've set up the community function, like the chat thing, to give people a place to discuss these ideas with me and maybe each other. That's open to everyone, free members. If you have a Patreon account, do join in. And, as always, feed the algorithm with likes and reviews and subscription, or tell your friends. See you in 2 weeks.